welcome to Trip the Beltway Fantastic. As you know, we aim to be a forum for voices inside and outside the Beltway, individuals who want to cast a harsh light on the war machine. We have a special treat for you today. My friends Dan Grazier and Julia Gledhill are two ace military analysts who recently shifted their work over to the Stimson Center, and I'm really excited to pick their brains today about their new program and about some of the great work they have been doing on what I call Beltway Bandits, the major defense contractors sucking our taxpayer dollars up like a hoover for, well, not much true benefit in return. There might be some folks listening who say, but Kelly, contractors help build the most powerful military in the world and our national defense. Well, my friends here are going to share with us how contractors get paid a lot to give us military products that are in many ways unnecessary or not as good as they profess to be. Sometimes they're not even safe for our service members who use them. So thank you, Julia and Dan, for joining me today on Trip the Beltway Fantastic.
Well, thank you very much for having us, Kelly.
Happy to be here.
So Dan, by the way, is a Marine Corp veteran who served as a tank commander in the Iraq and Afghanistan wars. And Julia is a defense budget and policy analyst who likes to dig into the shadowy numbers game in the Pentagon. Both write fantastic, informative articles, some of them even for responsible statecraft. Can you tell me, guys, before we start off on the nitty gritty about the shenanigans of Beltway Bandits, can you talk to me a little bit about your new program?
Sure. So we decided a couple weeks ago that we needed to expand our work. And just with all the issues coming up here in the next couple of years, we needed a bigger platform and a larger mandate to do the kind of work that we need to do in order to highlight these issues. And the Stimson Center was gracious enough to provide us a home where we're now surrounded by a bunch of other foreign and national security policy experts. So we'll be able to work together with all the great talent that was already at Stimson and hopefully add our own little spin to affect positive change.
Yeah. Julie, you want to add anything to that?
All I'll say is that I'm really excited to tackle a lot of the same waste, fraud, and abuse issues, really talk about Pentagon accountability from this broader lens, being able to talk about strategic realities, as well as U.S. foreign policy writ large, and the root causes of the militarism that drives it. And I'm so grateful and stoked to be at the Stimson Center, surrounded by so many wonderful colleagues, while still being able to work with Dan and our other colleague, Jeff.
Yeah, I mean, it strikes me, being in this city for many years as a reporter, there are not a lot of think tanks that actually tackle the issue of waste, fraud, and abuse in the military industrial complex. I mean, I know it probably sounds pretty shop-worn, but most of the think tanks in Washington are pretty much geared to supporting the ecosystem, not criticizing or lifting the hood and looking at what's underneath. So how much of a space, that you are filling here? I mean, are there competitors in this realm, or is this a really a kind of a niche space that you're working in?
We are pretty niche. You're absolutely right. Most of the other think tanks who write about these kind of issues take a lot of money from the defense industry. And we very purposefully only take donations from people who don't actually have a financial stake in the outcome of the work that we do. It's just, individuals and foundations that are interested in making sure that we actually have an effective national security policy that does not bankrupt our grandchildren. And so we're happy to fill that. It's a bit of a challenge because we're just a small team and we have to battle the entire military industrial congressional complex. But fortunately, we have the truth on our side. And so even though we are small, we can have a big impact just because we get to tell the truth in a way that a lot of other people can't.
I want to ask you, Dan, as a veteran, you have an advantage of seeing the military from the inside and knowing the mechanics of it, where the bodies are buried, so to speak. But at the same time, do you ever get criticized for not like remaining on the team, so to speak, for being one of the naysayers, for being contrarian in a world in which a lot of military, once they, service members leave, whether it be after their 20-year deployment or rather retirement, go into the military industrial complex, often working for private contractors. So they're continuing that symbiotic relationship. You've actually sort of done the opposite. Do you get any flack from that? Do you get any resistance?
Occasionally, I do. I've certainly gotten my fair share of hate mail over the years,
Wow.
particularly over my work in the F-35. But shockingly, that has dropped off significantly in the last couple of years, because in the 9 years that I've been writing about the F-35, I have never ever had to pull back a story or issue a correction or anything like that, because again, the truth is on my side. And so my critics have seemed to retreat very suddenly over the last couple of years, just because everything that I've written about the F-35 has proven correct. And in some cases, it's actually even worse than I ever really said.
Yeah.
So, but it's interesting, though, the response that I get from friends and colleagues in the military. There are some that consider me a bit of a turncoat, but they're the minority. Most of the people that I do still talk to encourage me a great deal in the work that I do, because they know that I'm telling the truth, and just for whatever personal situation that they might happen to be in, they might not come out publicly and say that kind of stuff. But behind closed doors, I get a lot of encouragement from people that are either veterans themselves or are still in uniform.
I have to agree with you there. As an editor of a magazine and as a reporter in this space for a long time, I can attest that there are military veterans all over the place, on the left side of the dial, on the right side of the dial, who have bared witness to the waste, fraud, and abuse, are happy when people are talking about it publicly. They might not feel as confident writing about it themselves, but you are right. They know that you're telling the truth. It's what they do with that information. Those who work for the military industrial complex after retirement basically just sort of subsume that, turn a blind eye to it. They've reconciled that in some way as they maintain their relationship within the system. And then there are a lot of veterans out there who have eschewed it and are happy to hear that there are people who are challenging that publicly, because they know it ultimately it doesn't help the military, the rank and file, whether it be training, whether it be safety, whether it be an effective fighting force, and when you have corruption in the programs, the acquisitions, the contracting. I'd like to talk a little bit more about that today. But just for our viewers, you mentioned the F-35. Can you just quickly just talk about what you mean in terms of like what program and why it's so egregious?
Yeah, so the F-35 is currently for better or worse, kind of the future backbone of tactical aviation in the U.S. military. 3 different variants: one for the Air Force, one for the Marine Corps, one for the Navy. The program has been in development since October of 2001, when Lockheed Martin was awarded the contract. Only just in the last couple of weeks did the Pentagon's acquisition chief authorize full rate production for the F-35, which, when you compare the announcement of full rate production, which is it's a major milestone in the life cycle of a program, and particularly the F-35 is the largest weapons program in history. when the announcement of the contract award back in 2001 was made, it was a big deal. It was done with a lot of fanfare. The announcement of Floor 8 production was a press release that was quietly released on the Pentagon's website a random Tuesday afternoon. And so, and if you actually read the quotes in that press release, the acting testing director who had to sign off on the report, he did not actually say that the F-35 is effective and suitable for use with the troops. He mentioned how the Joint Program Office is working on their recommendations, to correct problems that they identified. That's not exactly what you want to see when a program that has consumed so much time and money and is supposed to be the premier fighter aircraft in the world. You would expect some more fulsome praise at that decision moment.
Wow.
And so it's still fraught with problems. It's going to be years before there's any chance of ironing out all the kinks with the F-35. And in the meantime, the services are already kind of looking beyond the F-35, because now we're the Next Generation Air Dominance Program, which again is not that's not a very ringing endorsement for for this program that has consumed like all of these resources to get just to this point.
I mean, is there a chance that it'll become obsolete in terms of the technology and the capability, the need or necessity for the military after all that?
Yeah, so there's already a problem of obsolescence with the F-35. So the services have not taken delivery of new F-35s for many months now, because the upgraded computer that they want to install in the F-35 has not completed development. That just shows how much time has passed since this whole program began, that the computer that was originally included in the F-35 is now obsolete, and now they have to develop a new one to give the F-35 the capabilities that they promised. So from that perspective, yes, it's the original F-35 is already obsolete. They had a hard time developing that computer, and now they're having even more difficulty developing, this new Technical Refresh 3 computer that they're working on right now. And so, and these problems are going to carry forward. There's a lot of design flaws that have yet to be addressed properly. Just based on the testing director's comments about the initial operational test and evaluation process, it does not look like it got a clean bill of health, through that process. And the fact that the actual testing report, which in most cases, in most acquisition programs, the initial operational test and evaluation report is released in an unclassified form. There's some classified information that would be included in an annex, but from what I understand, even the transmittal letter for the report from the testing director to the Pentagon officials, even that was classified. So they're working very hard to make sure that you do not know how well the F-35 actually did in testing.
Oh my goodness. That's there's a there. We just don't know what, because it's classified.
There is.
Well, I give you a lot of props, Stan, because I know you've been writing about this for some time. And like you said, everything you've written has been borne out. Nothing that you have written has been hyperbolic or inflated in terms of the concerns or critiques. It's been a disaster every step of the way. I think our former Secretary of Defense for 2 minutes, Chris Miller, under the Trump administration, actually called it a piece of shit publicly.
Yes. He did the country a great service with that, actually, because up until that point, you did not hear any prominent, civilian or uniform leader in the Department of Defense openly criticizing the F-35. Right. There were some grumblings, and there were, Senator McCain used to ask a lot of pointed questions about the program, but he never really took any meaningful steps to correct it. But as soon as acting Defense Secretary Miller said that seemed to that seemed to give license to everyone else to come out and start publicly
That's right.
criticizing
All it
35.
takes is one person to like open the door, and then all the floodgates were open, and another cliche, open season on F-35. So all of the critiques had been ongoing in articles and industry magazines, places like the Responsible Statecraft or the American Conservative. But I feel like publicly, with like military voices coming out and saying, okay, come on, let's end the charade here.
Right. And after that, before that moment, almost everything that was written about the F-35, other than by people like me, was all, this is the greatest thing that's ever been created.
Right.
You hardly see anything like that now. So, acting secretary, Defense Secretary Miller's brief tenure had a huge impact just because of that one comment.
Yeah, no, that's great. Sometimes that's all it takes. So I want to talk a little bit about defense contractors and how they've taken advantage of two major moments in recent history and the American economy. One being COVID and the ensuing inflation, and then secondly, the invasion of Ukraine and the sort of war footing that Ukraine has had to get on, and then the United States has also had to get on to support Ukraine. And I want to talk to you, Julia, about this because you've written about how the top five, or the giant or the major primes, prime contractors for the defense industry, have sort of manipulated Congress, have manipulated the system in the Pentagon to exploit these moments in our economy to their advantage. Can you talk a little bit about some of the benefits, the deregulation, the accelerated timetables, or what these prime contractors have done, and whether or not it was justified for them to get special treatment under these conditions?
Sure. Yeah, happy to. Contractors are certainly good at getting Congress to do to do their bidding. So I'll start with the inflation question because it's one that I have thought a lot about and that I think few people care about because it's not a fun topic. I wouldn't say it's like the most sexy policy issue by any means. But for the last several years, we've seen contractors use inflation as justification for what are called economic price adjustments. And without getting into the wonky details, essentially what this means is contractors are asking Congress for more money outside of their negotiated military contracts to cover so-called inflation costs. Now, there are a few things to remember in kind of thinking about whether or not this money is justified. First, Heidi Peltier of Brown University Cost of War Project has laid out why inflation is a bad reason to increase military spending, which is what these economic price adjustments do. And the main reasons are, well, the Department of Defense is not a consumer, therefore it experiences and measures inflation differently. It's also resourced accordingly. So it's not experiencing inflation in the way that we do when we go to the grocery store. Despite this, Congress has granted industry these economic price adjustments to what are called fixed price contracts. Now, there are a variety of fixed price contracts, but all that you really need to know is what the name signifies, which is that they're fixed price, right? And when you sign a contract, that's kind of it. You assume risk. So contractors in that situation are assuming risk of unexpected cost increases, externalities. Now, the primes make the majority of their revenues from government contracts. Lockheed makes like 80% of its annual revenues from government contracts. So keep that in mind. Think about the executives who are making hundreds of millions of dollars every single year, and that's just base salary. They're raking it in. They're okay. They're fine. Yet Congress is quite receptive to them crying poor because of inflation, even though they measure inflation differently, they're resourced accordingly, they assume the risk of externalities when they sign fixed price contracts, right? Like, sorry, but them's the breaks. You have to pick up those costs.
Totally.
Sign a contract. Like, that's what the rest of us have to do. And so, we've seen contractors really exploit this inflation crisis, which I think is an emotional one. I mean, it really resonates with people. I know I personally have seen my grocery bill like almost double in the past few years, and it sucks. And so people, I think, are quite receptive to that. I think they care about it. And when they hear, major corporations making these arguments, and then also, invoking Ukraine and Israel and the pandemic in order to, I think, win hearts and minds, if you will.
Yes, yes.
It makes sense to people, but it's something that warrants a lot of criticism and investigation.
Scrutiny. Yeah.
Once you start peeling back the layers, you realize, like, no, that's, it's not justified. They assume this risk. They're not experiencing inflation in the way that consumers do. Yet we've seen Congress give these price adjustments, which is literally retroactive changes to a negotiated contract that's already underway, which is extremely atypical. I don't want to say unprecedented because I haven't checked that box in my research, but it's very, very strange, and it costs a lot of money.
So what about regulation, red tape, accelerated timetables? It sounds like these are things that the primes were already asking for, but now they're using the war in Ukraine, probably the war in Israel as well, as justification for getting some of the things that they wanted all along. And are they successful in those demands because of these justifications?
Yeah, totally. So I guess I'll talk about Ukraine first, and then I'll talk a little bit about Israel. But yeah, so in the Ukraine context, again, contractors have really taken advantage of the urgency around aid to Ukraine. Obviously the president has kind of framed the Ukraine war as this global struggle between democracy and autocracy, and we're, defending democracy in Ukraine. And so it's very, emotional. Again, I think that that's really critical in thinking about all of this, and contractors are very good at leveraging that. So one way that contractors have exploited the situation for their own financial gain, for their personal benefit, even when you talk about the executives, is, they've pushed for, like you said, carve outs and regulations and different legislative proposals to essentially expedite the provision of Ukraine aid. So a couple of years ago, we saw Congress grant the Pentagon what were characterized as emergency wartime procurement powers. I wrote about this, I think, at the end of 2022. I actually had to reread my piece, and I was like, wow, that was a long time ago. So much has happened. But yeah, so the reason that matters is, wartime procurement powers, questionable. We're not at war. We're supporting Ukraine, and that's important. But what we saw Congress do is essentially give the Pentagon much more authority to grant contractors multi-year contracts. And that matters because the majority of the contracts that, these primes, Lockheed, Raytheon, et cetera, receive from the government are annual contracts. And, they hate that. They hate CRs. They hate that Congress is always late passing their bills. So do I. But they would love to lock in that multi-year funding for a particular program or programs. Now, there are some arguments to be made around how multi-year procurement can be more cost effective when you're talking about really large systems like naval vessels or aircraft. But what we've seen since the start of the Ukraine war is the provision of multi-year contracts for all types of weapons, not just really large ones that would benefit from, that kind of assurance to contractors so that they can make the capital investments necessary to just build really big, expensive stuff. And so, we've seen multi-year contracts for things like artillery shells and HIMARS and those types of weapons that Ukraine has, needed throughout their fight. And I have a lot of questions about multi-year procurement. Again, there is a cost-effective argument to make for really large systems, but there's essentially no data showing savings for smaller programs, light weapons, small arms, and just like anything that doesn't meet that threshold of like a
Yeah.
major aircraft. So I've been keeping an eye on this. It's going to be a few years until we have that data, but best believe I will be checking that out. And I'm sure GAO, CRS will be too. So keep your eyes peeled. But, we're going to feel this impact in 5, 10 longer years. Like we're going to be paying for it for the rest of our lives. And so we do have to have that moment of reflection and say, is this actually cost effective? Is it faster? I think the argument we hear a lot from industry is, oh, we need multi-year procurement contracts. We need to, for example, waive requirements for contractors to give the Pentagon cost and pricing information, which is really important for the Pentagon to be able to negotiate a fair deal and make sure they're not getting fleeced, make sure they're not overpaying, getting price gouged. And so, in some of these multi-year procurement authorities, since the beginning of the Ukraine war, there are exemptions for the provision of cost and pricing data, which really increases the risk of price gouging. And again, it's going to take years for all of this information to unfold. So I'll be very keen to dig into that. And then I'll say something very quick about Israel. I know I've rambled a little bit, but
not at all.
And I will just preface this by saying I'm not an arms sales expert, and I very much refer listeners to our Stimson colleagues, Rachel Stoll and Elias Youssef, on these issues. However, I think one major regulatory change that we've seen since the conflict in Gaza began is the wave of annual limits for transfers to what's called WRSA-I, the War Reserve Stockpile for Allies and Israel. Essentially, since I think the 90s, we have been, putting gold in a pot in Israel for them to draw upon when they want to. And there were some restrictions around like when they could pull from that. Ari Talani from the Center for International Policy has written about this recently in these times. So the Biden administration was like, we need to waive the limits on transfers to WRSA-I to the stockpile, and essentially let Israel pull from that stockpile without limitation. And the big example of like why folks wanted to do this is because of precision-guided missiles, PGMs, which are like these huge bombs. They're like 1,000, 2,000 pound bombs that were Israel's relied upon greatly, particularly at the beginning of the war. They're a bit of a misnomer. I think whenever we hear precision, precise, in the context of any type of lethal strike, it again warrants a lot of skepticism. But yeah, those PGMs are really important. There's actually a new bill also to increase the value threshold at which the Pentagon is required to notify Congress about arms sales. So it's like we have this stockpile, we have all these secret arms sales that have happened. That's the other thing that's happened since October 7th. The only things we really know for sure that we've sent to Israel are like the artillery shells and I can't remember the other one. But so, we've seen rollbacks to transparency on arms sales issues and waiving of limitations on like this stockpile that Israel draws from.
I don't even know where to start because it's making me so angry because on one hand, we're running out of stuff, right? So the defense industry can say, well, we're running out of stuff. You need to ramp up. And we need all the ability to do that, whether that's cutting the red tape or carve outs for regulations or with Israel, like drawing back some of the restrictions on the stockpile. So how do we reconcile this? I mean, it does seem between Israel and Ukraine that we've drawn down a lot in our own stockpiles. So how do you challenge the argument by the administration and the defense industry that they need all the tools that they can to ramp up so that we can maintain our capabilities as the most powerful military in the world? I mean, Dan, you must hear this all the time in terms of like this argument, but like, what do you say as a watchdog of this industry? How do you retort that kind of argument?
Well, so I think that argument is very telling. I was really struck when President Biden made his Oval Office pitch for increased aid to Ukraine and Israel. I think in that speech, at the very end of it, he made the military-industrial congressional complex's argument, where he said, "Hey, look, all this money is going to be spent in the United States. We're going to use this money to build new stuff to replace the old stuff that we've been giving overseas." And so I think it's important for people to understand like how the DC blob kind of operates. For nearly the better part of 20 years, we had the global war on terrorism that kept that created an alibi for the people who wanted to inflate defense budgets. So you could justify year to year annual defense spending increases because, hey, we got to fight the war on terrorism. Well, meanwhile, they were spending the money buying things like F-35s and littoral combat ships and Ford class aircraft carriers that had no role whatsoever in fighting the war on terror. Well, when that ended, then all of a sudden it was, we have to prepare to fight a war against China. And you heard that for a couple of years, and that sent defense spending into the stratosphere. And then after the Afghanistan withdrawal, which happened in August of 2021, which was quickly followed less than 6 months later by the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And now all of a sudden that became a new excuse to spend even more money. So they'll glom onto anything, like any global crisis, whether it's real, the war on terror, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, those are real things, or they'll just make something up. Like the Chinese are getting ready to imminently invade Taiwan. Like they'll use whatever scenario they can to increase defense spending. And so, the arguments today that we need to spend more money to rebuild or to restock the munition stockpiles, it has to be filtered through that lens. Like it's important for people to really understand what's going on here, and it's important to question these kind of things too, because there is this modus operandi creates a negative incentive. I think most people would love to see the wars in both Ukraine and in Israel and Gaza end today. I know I would, but there's a negative incentive in the United States because there's a lot of people who make a lot of money by spreading these defense dollars around. And so there's a perverse incentive to extend those as long as possible so we can pass more $95 billion, aid packages. And quite frankly, there's a perverse incentive for a wise antagonist to make it look like there's a crisis to also goad the United States into spending a bunch of money. Because don't forget, this package that was signed into law last week included $8.1 billion for Taiwan. Last time I checked, there isn't anybody shooting in Taiwan right now. But yet we're still giving them money because there's this impression. So it's just important. Everyone needs to pay attention to this kind of stuff because it sounds maybe like a little bit like a conspiracy. Just look at the information, look at the data that's available, and you can see that there is something very strange going on right now.
Yeah. And Julia, you had written a piece for Responsible Statecraft entitled "Biden Wants to Put the U.S. on Permanent War Footing." That's no joke. I mean, he announced a new national defense industrial strategy to, quote, catalyze generational change of the defense industrial base and to, quote, meet the strategic moment. This is a blueprint for supersizing the defense industry, the military industrial complex, against the backdrop of the wars and the externalities that Dan was just mentioning. Can you talk a little bit about how this is becoming institutionalized as a policy? And I realize this is a big topic, but I'm not so sure that all listeners who haven't been following this regularly know that Biden came out and announced an industrial policy that would put us more on a war footing. Can you talk about the dangers of that?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll just start by saying that, as a person who's the majority of my life has been the war on terror, which, continues in less visible but still very nefarious and dangerous ways. It terrifies me that we have a president that wants to change over the course of a generation, our defense industrial base so that we can do everything and more. Yes, like there are conversations to be had about how we can be more discerning about, the types of military spending that we send, who we send it to, when we send it. That's when you get into kind of nuts and bolts that can get you in trouble in DC or blacklist you. And I will just say that in terms of kind of tackling a big issue like this national defense industrial base strategy, which hasn't had much fanfare. The regular defense outlets have covered it briefly, but it's like we have a moment of opportunity to influence the implementation of this plan. I'm terrified. I don't want to spend the rest of my life paying for that. For what? For more war? Especially after seeing the war on terror, the way that we institutionalized discrimination and entrapment and just like all the terrible things that we used as a veil for what was really going on, which is, the United States wreaking havoc on the world yet again. I think like there's a lot of research and analysis to be done on defense industrial base issues right now because of Ukraine, because of Israel, because of China. I actually am starting to work on one of my first pieces for Stimson, which is going to be building on that piece I wrote for Responsible Statecraft and kind of digging my heels in a little bit because we need to look at like what's been successful and supporting Ukraine, for example. I think one of the biggest success stories of Ukraine aid has been the Army Scranton ammunition plant, which has been really, churning out 155 artillery shells, ammunition. That's a government success. That's not a commercial success. So thinking about what parts of the defense industrial base, we need more government support, which parts can we rely on our partners? What things might we not tackle at all? It's not just about building manufacturing capacity, which everyone loves to talk about. It's quite a politicized issue, I think, as far as the economy goes. And, there's a greater conversation to be had there. But like, what's working and how do we double down on that? We can't do everything. We do have finite resources, and our government, our leaders, industry, the people raking in all the money from this, first of all, they're not living as long as I am. I have to pay for this. My generation has to deal with all this. And that pisses me off.
Yeah.
It pisses me off. And it's our job to make sure that they are like hearing us right now. Because there are more efficient and tactical and smarter decisions we can make with our economy right now. That's going to be far better for the American people and far better for the economy.
Absolutely. We've run out of time, but I just want to say, you two, represent like the best and the brightest in terms of our ability to challenge the military industrial complex and specifically policies like the one the Biden administration rolled out, like this defense policy, industrial policy, the industry and all of its lobbying efforts for more goodies and more carve-outs. We need people like you who are poking at it, that are exposing what's going on. I really like what you're saying, Julia, and really tying this to why should Americans care? Because it'll hit us in our pocketbooks. It'll hit us generationally. And the entire conversation in Washington ignores the fact that we could be using this money for other things, but also that this money is never tied to realist strategy. Are these strategies, the use of this money, in the best interest of America in terms of its policies in Ukraine, its policies with Israel over Gaza, on Taiwan and China? We never get to talk about that. Like, it's all about the money. It's all about building the hardware, but not questioning whether the strategy is sound. So I hope you guys will come back and talk more about specifically the work that you're doing. So like reports that you might have, things you're exposing, the corruption. Always look at me as a conduit or a platform so we can talk about this. We'll have the flexibility on the show to do those kinds of things. So I hope you'll come back on.
Well, thank you very much, Kelly. Thanks for having us. We're happy to be here. Happy to talk to you whenever. So it's important that everyone hears this, and I encourage everyone to to keep an eye on stimson.org to see the work that we do. This is day number 3 for us, so we're still getting our feet back underneath us, and but we'll have all kinds of work here in the next couple of weeks,
and we'll be excited to promote it.
Excellent.
Thank you, Kelly.